we're continuing in reading School Days According to Humphrey by Betty G Birney. And last time we read chapter 1, so here is chapter 2. Remember, in chapter 1, Humphrey was so excited for the first day of school, and then all of these different kids were coming in. And why do you think the different kids are coming in? Would that make sense to you? Yeah, it makes sense to us. But to Humphrey, he's like, wait, where did my other friends go? So, chapter 2, the worst first day gets worse. All right, here we go. The final bell rang, and everybody had taken a seat except the girl in a wheelchair who was already sitting. There was still one empty chair left. Mrs. Brisbane went to the door and looked out into the hall. Oh, there you are, she said. She opened the door wider, and a boy walked in. You must be the missing student, Mrs. Brisbane said. He's not missing, the boy answered. I'm not missing. Sorry, I read it wrong. I'm not missing, the boy answered. I'm right here. I thought he'd be in big trouble, so I was surprised when Mrs. Brisbane smiled and directed him to the empty chair. Then she stood in the front of the class. Good morning, class, Mrs. Brisbane said. Last year I had one of the best classes ever, but I think this class will be even better. Better? I squeaked. That was the best class in the whole wide world. Boing, boing, Og agreed. I wasn't sure what I said was true. On one paw, I couldn't imagine a better class than the one we'd had last year. On the other paw, here's my other paw, it was the only class I'd ever been in. But where had my classmates gone? I'm going to rearrange the seating later in the day, Mrs. Brisbane said, but for now, I'll take attendance. Are you listening, Og? I asked my neighbor. I can never be sure because he doesn't have any ears that I've ever seen, but he seems to understand me most of the time. Are we dreaming? I wondered. So far, the morning felt like one of those days where everything seems almost the same as in real life, but a lot weirder. For instance, I once had a dream where all of my human friends were rolling around in giant hamster balls. That was a very funny dream. Once I dreamed that the class was being taught by Mrs. Wright, the PE teacher. That wasn't a funny dream because she was always blowing on her loud whistle, which is painful to the small sensitive ears of a hamster. Again, Og didn't answer me. Maybe frogs don't dream. Then Mrs. Brisbane began to call out the strange words she'd been saying before. It turns out they were names. Kelsey Kirkpatrick? Here, the red-haired girl said, still rubbing her arm. Harry Ito? Mrs. Brisbane called out. Harry was the boy who'd been late to class. She called on Simon, who answered present. Present? I didn't see any presents. Was it somebody's birthday? Rosie Rodriguez? Mrs. Brisbane said. The girl in the wheelchair waved her hand and shouted out, Here! A boy named Thomas answered next, followed by a couple of girls, Phoebe and Holly. Are you paying attention, Og? I asked my friend. Og splashed a little but didn't answer. And then something really odd happened. Paul? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Right away, not one, but two voices replied, Here. One of them was small Paul from last year. The other Paul was the tall boy. Mrs. Brisbane smiled. I forgot. This year we have two Pauls in our class, Paul Fletcher and Paul Green. Now, how will we tell you apart? That was an easy question. One of them was small, and one of them was tall. Small Paul and tall Paul eyed each other. Neither of them looked happy to have another Paul in the class. What did your teacher do last year? She asked. He wasn't in my class, small Paul said. I went to another school, tall Paul added. Mrs. Brisbane nodded. I see. Do either of you have a nickname? Both boys shook their heads. Well, for now, let's call you Paul F. and Paul G. Is that all right with you? She asked. Both boys nodded. Then Mrs. Brisbane called out one more name. Joseph? A boy with curly brown hair shifted in his chair a little but didn't answer. Mrs. Brisbane looked around the class. Is Joseph here? The boy with curly brown hair nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said, but it's not Joseph. It's Joey. Just Joey Jones. Mrs. Brisbane smiled. All right, then, just Joey it is. Now, class, I'm very excited to get to know you and for you to get to know me. In case you don't know, I'm Mrs. Brisbane. The teacher wrote her name on the board. There were 2 other members of the class you need to know, she said. Then she wrote my name on the board. Humphrey is our classroom hamster, she said. Everybody, and I mean everybody, turned to look at me. Next, she wrote Og's name on the board. Og is our classroom frog. You'll get to know them both very well this year. You'll also have a chance to take Humphrey home for the weekend. I'll tell you more about that this afternoon, she said. The students all giggled and whispered and turned in their seats to look at us. Tell them they're in the wrong room, I suggested, and some of the students close to my cage giggled when they heard me go squeak, squeak, squeak. The teacher ignored me. First, let's get to know each other a little better. Would you take out your summer boxes? Summer boxes? I squeaked. What are they, Og? Summer was sunshine and campfires and unsqueakable fun. Summer wasn't something you could just put into a box. I'm not sure Og could hear me since he was splashing like crazy in his tank. But the strange students in class seemed to understand. They reached into their backpacks and pulled out boxes, all kind of boxes, and put them on their desks. How did they know about the boxes? I squeaked to Og. Why didn't we know? Og had no answer. During the previous school year, I tried hard to keep up with my friends' homework, taking tests along with them, writing papers, and even poems. Mrs. Brisbane didn't know I did the work, but I knew it, and that's what counts. All right, students, let's share our summer experiences, Mrs. Brisbane said. That way, I'll learn a little bit about all of you, and you'll learn about me because I brought a box too. Mrs. Brisbane took a box out of the drawer and placed it on her desk. I'll tell you about my summer first, she said. That got my attention. While I was at camp for the summer, Mrs. Brisbane was doing something else, but I still wasn't really sure what. My son lives in Tokyo, Japan, she said. He's a teacher there. This summer he got married, so my husband and I went to Japan for the wedding. The smile on Mrs. Brisbane's face let me know that she had a great, great, great time. Weddings in Japan are very beautiful, she said. The couple dresses in traditional Japanese kimonos. She held up a picture of a couple in very fancy clothes. That's my son Jason and his new wife Miki. Mrs. Brisbane sounded very proud. She passed around some Japanese money for the students to see. Next, she took out a real plastic ball she'd bought in Tokyo. I couldn't see it very well. Something's inside, Og. I scampered up to the top of my cage to get a better look. Boing, he replied. I guess he couldn't see either. I hope Humphrey won't be jealous, Mrs. Brisbane said. Meet Aki. She set the ball on the desk and the students howled with laughter as the ball started spinning wildly and colored lights flashed. Rockin' Aki, a strange, loud voice wailed. Rock and roll rules. The ball looped and twirled unexpectedly as the lights kept flashing and the music blared. Where is Aki? I shouted to Og, as if anyone could hear my squeaks over the noise. Where's Aki? Mrs. Brisbane shut the thing off. Show it to Humphrey, Simon suggested. Yes, show Humphrey, the other students begged. So Mrs. Brisbane brought the ball over to our table and set it down in front of my cage. I hope Aki doesn't scare you, Humphrey, but here goes. She pressed a button on the ball, and it all began again. The flashing lights, the looping and twirling, and the song, Rockin' Aki, rock and roll rules. Now I could see what everyone was laughing at. Aki was a tiny toy hamster with wild rainbow-striped fur, was rolling around in the hamster ball. Somehow, as the ball turned, he always remained upright as he danced. I wasn't scared, not one bit. But I was quite impressed. Rockin' Aki, I squeaked along. Of course, no one heard me. I couldn't even hear myself. Rock and roll rules. I was truly sorry when Mrs. Brisbane switched Aki off. I think that's enough rocking and rolling for today, she said. Some of the kids moaned, and I agreed with them. Mrs. Brisbane returned the ball to her desk. So now you know what I did this summer. I also sent letters to all of your homes asking you to bring in a box with something that represents your summer. Who would like to share next? I just had to squeak up for myself. Hey, nobody sent me a letter. Boing, boing, Og added. Some hands went up in the air and Mrs. Brisbane called on Simon. Say your name first, she said. Simon jumped up out of his chair, opened his box, and took out a photo of a very familiar place. Simon Morgenstern. Here's where I went. Camp Happy Hollow. They had a howler, and I was a blue jay, and I burped the loudest, and Mrs. Brisbane interrupted him. Slow down, Simon, she said. Take your time. Simon tried to slow down and told the class about some of the adventures he'd had at Happy Hollow. I'd had adventures there too, but of course I didn't have a box because no one told me to bring one. One by one, the other students shared their summer stories. Rosie had gone to a different camp. She held up a medal she'd won for winning a wheelchair race and a picture of her crossing the finish line. Boy, that Rosie could roll. Harry held up a t-shirt that said, I survived the blaster, and told about riding a really, really, really fast roller coaster. It sounded unsqueakably exciting to me. Small Paul had taken a computer class and showed us a page of something he called code, but it looked like gibberish to me. Tall Paul had a collection of pine cones from his family camping trip in the mountains. Holly held up an ear of corn she had grown herself when she visited her grandparents on a farm. I helped Grandma and Grandpa a lot, she said. I fed the chickens and weeded the garden, picked the vegetables, and took care of the dogs. My, that was helpful of you, Holly, Mrs. Brisbane agreed. And I rode a tractor and rode a horse and collected the eggs, the girl went on. Thank you, Holly. Next, Mrs. Brisbane called on a boy, waving his hand impatiently. I'm Thomas T. True, said a boy as he opened up a big box, and I went fishing with my grandpa, and I caught a fish that was huge. It was bigger than I am. I was impressed, and I guess the other students were too, because they were all whispering. Quiet, students, Mrs. Brisbane told them. Go on, Thomas. That fish was so big, it filled up the whole boat, so Grandpa and I had to swim to shore and pull the boat with us. Man, we ate fish for the rest of the summer. Thomas's eyes sparkled. Do you have a picture of it? Small Paul asked. Nope, we were too busy wrestling the fish to take a picture, so I brought Grandpa's favorite fly instead, Thomas said, reaching into the box. Boing, boing. Og leapt with excitement when he heard the word fly. After all, frogs think insects, like flies, are yummy. But the thing Thomas took out of the box wasn't even an insect. It was a goofy, feathery-looking thing. Grandpa ties his own flies. The fish think they're real flies, he explained. I hope Og wasn't too disappointed that the flies were fake. About that big fish, Mrs. Brisbane said. How did you get it in the boat if it was bigger than you? Thomas shook his head. It wasn't easy, teacher. It sure wasn't easy. Mrs. Brisbane told Thomas he could sit down and called on Kelsey. My mind was racing with thoughts of big, big, big fish that could probably eat a hamster and a frog if it wanted. But then I heard Kelsey say, broken arm. A broken arm sounded painful, so I listened carefully to her story. It was the last day of school. I was so happy it was vacation. When I got off the bus, I raced home, but I tripped coming up the front walk and broke my arm. She sighed. I was in a cast most of the summer. I couldn't go swimming even once. She opened her box and brought out a sling and a picture of her with a broken arm. The summer before that, I broke my leg, Kelsey explained. I'm so sorry, Kelsey, Mrs. Brisbane said. I was sorry, too. Who's left? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Joey? Joey stood up, but he didn't look anxious to talk. I didn't do anything, he said. I just stayed home. A stay-at-home vacation can be a lot of fun, said the teacher. Joey shrugged. It was okay. I played with my dog Skipper a lot. He reached in his box and pulled out a frisbee. He likes to catch this. He can leap way up and catch it with his teeth. He never misses. See? There are teeth marks all around the edge. I was starting to like Joey, but then I heard about Skipper's leaping in his teeth. I wasn't so sure. My experience with dogs had taught me that they are not especially friendly to hamsters and other small furry creatures. Mrs. Brisbane glanced down at the class list. And who else is left? Phoebe Pratt? The girl called Phoebe didn't stand up. She just sat there staring down at her table. I forgot, she said. You mean you left your box at home? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Phoebe shook her head. No, I forgot to make a box. The girl looked miserable. Well, you can tell us what you did anyway. It was nice of Mrs. Brisbane not to be mad at Phoebe. Slowly the girl stood up. I had a stay-at-home vacation too, she said, but I don't have a dog. Can you think of anything fun that you did? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Phoebe thought for a few seconds. I played games with my grandmother, she said. Mrs. Brisbane asked questions about what kinds of games Phoebe liked to play, but I could tell that the girl was embarrassed that she didn't have a summer box. So was I. Thanks for sharing, Phoebe. You may sit down now, Mrs. Brisbane said. It's almost time for recess, so please put your boxes away. But before you go outside, I need to find an assistant for Rosie. Not even 1 second went by before the girl named Holly waved her hand, shouting, Me! Oh, please, I'll do it! Very well, Holly, Mrs. Brisbane said. You and Rosie stay behind for a minute so I can tell you what to do. That annoying bell rang again, and the students all left the room, except Holly and Rolling Rosie. Mrs. Brisbane explained that Holly would make sure the path was clear for Rosie's wheelchair, help her if she couldn't reach something, see that she got outside safely in an emergency, and anything else that Rosie needed her to do. I'll do a good job, Holly said. I'm sure you will, Mrs. Brisbane turned to Rolling Rosie. You'll have to make sure that Holly knows when you need help. Don't worry about it, Rosie said with a big smile. I don't need much help at all. Mrs. Brisbane smiled back. Then I think it's time for you girls to go out to the playground. She watched as Holly swung the door wide open for Rosie's wheelchair and closed it again when they were in the hall. Then she turned to Og and me. We have the whole year ahead of us to get to know these students. These strange students were staying for the rest of the year? Then she said, so far so good. So far, I couldn't see anything good about the first day of school. I was too busy wondering what all my old friends from room 26 were doing and trying to figure out exactly where they were. Humphrey's rules for school. If your teacher asks you to bring something to class, try not to forget. Of course, sometimes the teacher forgets to tell you what to bring, and that makes you feel bad. Have a good day.